And I think, too, you'll find, and something I've seen over time, is we have 5 billion consumers using our products. They are expecting us to act responsibly. And I think you're finding that people are becoming more and more educated about these kinds of things and caring more about them. And they want to buy brands that are coming from companies that they know are acting responsibly. So I think it's another one of these kind of business drivers for this kind of thing, of meeting the needs of the consumers that you serve.
So, Len, but what about government regulation, and what about costs, and what about the difficulty of doing business, which we hear a lot about?
Just details we overcome, so it's your points are very well taken, and if I look at something like moving towards renewable materials, the biggest issue with moving to renewable materials is oil at $50 a barrel right now. That makes that very difficult because, again, you're working from an economic standpoint, and we're not going to pay more for renewables. It's got to be cost parity if it's going to be building the business. So it's a matter of finding then those opportunities that enable you to move to a renewable, in a way that's cost effective. And I'll give you one example. We're making plastic bottles from sugarcane now, as opposed to petroleum. Some of our executions are doing that right now. And again, from a climate standpoint, that's very much a step in the right direction to be using sugarcane instead of fossil fuels from greenhouse gas emissions. Now, as you move to that, though, you confront with a whole host of new problems. People have their issues with petroleum, but it is a very efficient source of carbon. If you move to sugarcane, now you're into agriculture, which is a very inefficient source of carbon. And also you have issues of land use, you have pesticides, you've got irrigation, water, all these kinds of things. So as you go down the path of switching from the non-renewable, the fossil fuel, to the renewable, you have a whole set of work that you need to do to ensure that you're not moving to something that is worse. So we have life cycle assessors in the department who can go in and look at all the numbers and figure out how to do this. And what we have found is we can only make this work if we are making the plastic in Brazil using Brazilian sugar. Now, why? A couple of reasons. Number one, you're in these plantations there that don't require irrigation because of the climate there. Also because of the climate, you have a fast-growing season. And as you harvest the sugar, you can take the remnants, the scraps, and burn them for the fuel to run the plant. So it makes it work if you do it there. We could never do it in the United States. We could never ship sugar from some place and go to another. So these kinds of complexities come into bear as you look at these things. It's never simple, and you've got to make sure that as you make these moves from one thing to another, you're not actually making a step in the worst direction.
Can you share what you and I talked about on sort of the effort to get people to wash in cold water?
Sure.
Because I think that's interesting, again, it is how do you create immediate benefit?
Yep. And that's, we did a life cycle assessment of Procter & Gamble's energy footprint, or where within our entire life cycle as a company, of all the products we made, all the steps in the life cycle of those products, from the creation of raw materials, manufacturing, disposal, use in the home, where was the greatest impact from a greenhouse gas emission? And it came to being the heating of water for laundry. And it may sound like a little thing, but 4% of household energy is used to heat water for laundry. I mean, it's an astounding number if you convert that to greenhouse gas emissions. It's equal to the energy use of around 5 million homes. So seeing that as an opportunity, we went out and developed laundry detergents, Tide Cold Water, that you may be aware of, the new pods that have come out. And these are detergents that clean in cold water at a level of performance that you would see in hot or warm. So consumers can now switch to cold water and not have a performance deficit. Now, if I were to tell you I can get your clothes just as clean in cold water as you do today in hot, would you believe me? Yeah, no, yeah, and that's the problem I deal with. You've got to get over this consumer behavior piece of this. So we've had an education program that has been going forward for the past several years where we are moving the world's population from hot, warm water washing to cold. We started in the United States, where I think is probably where we're about 28, 29% cold water washing were now over 50% because of the education. Now, as we approached consumers about this, we never talked about the fact that when they do this, they would reduce greenhouse gas emissions, or that it would be better for the environment. Because unfortunately, a lot of consumers don't care. I mean, there's a very small percentage of consumers that really understand these issues and would do this for that. So we positioned it as you will save money on your electric bill by not heating the water. And it went well. And in fact, there was a period of time, you may have seen this in your Duke Energy bill, little inserts in there talking about how you can save money on your electric bill by washing in cold water. It is the most simplest thing that people can do. There's no trade-offs. There's a positive to you. Everybody wins. We have increased sales. You know, you save money. Your clothes still get clean, you know. So, I mean, and I can see you all use Tide anyway, you know, by how nice everybody looks. So, you know, if you want to do one thing to save the earth, wash your clothes in cold water.
Can I just jump in very, very briefly? I'll just say that this is possibly a suggestion for Len specifically, but it's also an interesting part of the research. It turns out that people often do not react to statements that this will help the environment so much or save you this much water or et cetera, but they do react if they find out that X percentage of their neighbors are behaving a certain way. And so if you can include in their electric bill how well you're doing relative to your community or relative to others in your area who've been buying it, most people are some version of conditional cooperator. They will change their activity based on if they see most other people engaging in behavior in that way.
And I'll give a challenge. I saw some students that were here today. We had a program with an outreach on this cold water washing to college students, because usually that's the first time you do laundry, right? If you don't take it home, right? It's the first time you do laundry. So we instead of trying to change the habit of someone, let's just get them ingrained with washing in cold water from the start. So a lot of campuses have come and worked in their laundry rooms to put signs up about washing in cold water. So a challenge to Xavier students.
I'd like to jump in on this one as well, because I just think, you know, this is just such a great example of, first of all, how important systems thinking is, and how as a company moves from this, that's not our problem, to compliance. Well, I'll do it if I have to, all right, we'll manage it because it might save us some money, to, oh, well, you know, maybe working on climate change is strategic, all the way up to this idea of civil influence, of we take our social compact very seriously. That forces a company, it forces an institution to begin to think systematically and think in terms of systems, which requires that you start to talk to a broader audience. You start to talk to the folks in Brazil who are growing the sugarcane. You start to talk to NGOs who might have been your provocateurs earlier. But what happens when people start talking to each other? And I think what has been so profoundly moving for me, I feel people keep making jokes because I've been working on this project for 9 months. And I feel like, you know, I really, really see Cincinnati, like this is my Cincinnati baby after 9 months, is because when you start to see communities talking to each other and crossing boundaries and thinking systemically, and I think folks like the Green Business, it's the Green Business Development Council. Help me, Scott, are you here? Green Business Council, thank you. You know, or the Green Umbrella, who have brought together different conversations. Suddenly innovations like this start to come up. And companies, and I think one of the reasons that ICCR spends so much time talking with companies and engaging them over the long term, in spite of the fact that we know regulation isn't often popular, in spite of the fact that we know there's a huge amount of money being paid to lobbyists and political campaigns and other things that may create a policy environment that we're not that excited about. You know, there's a lot of these things going on. In spite of all of that, we still want to sit across the table and have these conversations, because what winds up happening is companies have the power that when they have a good idea, they can innovate locally, they can innovate globally, they can bring players together that can make things happen. And if you give up on that idea, you're losing an awful lot of the power to solve very, very complex problems like climate change. So that was just a great example. Thank you. Thank you both.
So we've talked about collective impact, in pieces collaboration. I'm kind of interested, I think, in terms of spectrums sometimes. You know, you can be all the way over here, all the way over here. On a spectrum from adversarial to collaborative, where do you think we are today? And there are a lot of different pieces of collaboration. It's collaboration on the ground with suppliers. It's being collaborative, non-adversarial between investors and companies. There are a lot of players here, but as we think about that spectrum, where are we? What kind of players in this game have moved the furthest? And maybe who still needs to come along? I assume there are new players in the game who weren't even in the game some time ago. Paint a picture of that spectrum for me.
So I'll take it from two sets of players, and some of the other panelists may take it from a different set of players. I'm going to talk about our organization, the group that invests money on behalf of our stakeholders, which are participants, and the stakeholders themselves. So it is the church. We have a lot of people that have moral and ethical views. There's a group that is very vocal and have very strong opinions that we have no right to hold investments in fossil fuel companies. They have demanded that we divest, and they make the moral case and they make the business case. I would be less than candid if I didn't say they got our attention. And I would be less than candid if I didn't say we have not implemented policies as a result of their engagement with us. So at the end of last year, we adopted a policy on climate change related to thermal coal. Now, you heard me say at the beginning that I approach things from a returns perspective. We did an in-depth analysis of all fossil fuels. We ended up focusing on thermal coal because we talked to the people that manage money for us, and we said, you know, we looked into your holdings, and you guys don't hold any thermal coal stocks. What's that all about? Because we do hold there are passive investment strategies and there are active. When you're passive, you just buy everything in the universe. When you're active, you're picking and choosing. And there's this belief that it's better to be passive because it's cheaper than to be active. So we talked to the active folks and we said, why don't you hold any thermal coal stocks? It's a lousy business and it's going down the tubes quickly. And so then we looked at our passive portfolios and we had a bunch of coal stocks, and it made no sense for us to hold coal stocks because all the people that are smart told us that it's a lousy business. So we made the decision to purge the coal stocks from our portfolio. Well, as I was talking to someone earlier, I have a feeling that I've done the right thing because I've gotten hate mail on both sides. Those that are supportive of the coal industry are saying, you tree huggers, you're bowing to the political pressure, and on and on and on. And those that are advocating for fossil fuel divestment are saying, well, that's a good step, but you haven't gone nearly far enough. We're not going to end, because there is a website. It's called Fossil Free UMC. And if you open up the website, in large letters, it says, tell the General Board of Pension and Health Benefits, that's the name of our organization, to divest of all fossil fuels. So I would say we have tried to move in the right direction. We have tried to be more responsive to the issue, but I'm not seeing much acceptance of our approach to addressing the climate change issue.
Laura and I had a conversation earlier. I don't necessarily want to bring that up right now unless you care to, which is a very interesting anecdote, but it has to do with the fact that the dominant narrative of our times is not one of well, I hope it's becoming one of the collective management of this climate commons, but the prevalent one when people think of the other in the United States especially is the clash of civilizations. It's the argument that there's us and then there's them, and we have to be a fortress. There's fifth columnists, there's terrorists, et cetera, and how can you possibly build collective action with people who are potentially your enemies? Well, together, Muslims and Christians make up 55% of our planet, of our human population. And overcoming that mistrust, coordinating collective actions based on common premises, based on common starting ethical points, not papering over the differences between our religious traditions, but laying a foundation for many diverse kinds of collective action. Not necessarily purely divestment, not necessarily purely voice. There's also other kinds of community activism. There's lobbying. There's changes at the level of the individual, the family, the community that are kind of a collective movement in consciousness. Doing that is difficult. And so we have seen, we're at the 50th anniversary of the Nostra Aetate declaration from the Catholic Church, which positioned the Catholic community in a very respectful dialogic position with other religious traditions of the world. And it was a big shift. What we have seen here in the Common Word document is an affirmation of a central Muslim teaching that presents an authoritative perspective from the heart of the Muslim tradition that is effectively a scholarly consensus on how Muslims and Christians are to relate with each other and implicitly others. And so we have the tools, and it's an extremely exciting time, but what we need is models for implementation. And this is where groups like the activist investors of the Interfaith Center are so extraordinarily important. There's a bridge here between a transnational class of capital. We see more and more Muslim communities being integrated into capital markets. And there's this big question of what that means in terms of socially responsible investing, and the consciousness has a long way to go. And so people still kind of separate the active investment from the wider social consequences of it, from the externalities, if you will. And so awakening that sense of community commonwealth is really a central part of things that I think the process of log rolling brings about, which is small actions that stimulate others to emulate them and to replicate them and absorb similar kinds of norms, and to then, as they further escalate, get emulated, we hope that there is a norm cascade where others start to emulate without direct instruction.
Let me, what do you think people are skeptical about in this discussion these days that they shouldn't be anymore? And what maybe should they be skeptical about or exploring more critically than they are at this stage in this issue?
Okay, it's my turn to be a little provocative. And I think it really builds on the story that these three gentlemen have been telling today. I think there is this heart sometimes in activist communities where the beginning of the story is finding misbehavior, pointing it out, shining a light and saying, oh, look how bad this is. There's a real role for that. That's important. It's powerful. But I think what we should be skeptical about is when you look at something that is so complex as climate change, when someone says, oh, here's the easy solution. Now, we didn't hear Len say if everybody washes their clothes in cold water, it will solve climate change. What he said was, that's a log rolling behavior. If we all start to do that, it'll get better. If a company like Cintas starts to do it, who I believe their business is largely laundry, wow, what a difference that can make.